Are we good? Hope so. Not too complicated today. We're basically looking at a simple, was a dark and stormy night that day. The party all was quiet. Everyone who came to sell something found someone to buy it. And when we go to buy a donut and a cup of coffee, we usually buy the two together. It's something that we buy as a bundle. Now, if you only got $1 in your pocket, I still don't have any money in my pocket. If you only got $1 in your pocket, you could choose between either a cup of coffee or a donut. But really, what would make you happier is a half a donut and a half a cup of coffee. At least that way you have some of the bundle, right? There's more between the two that way. So coffee and donuts could be substitutes for each other, but we prefer that they not be. We prefer that they be complements to one another. And so it's important that when we analyze a situation like this, we go back and think to the fundamentals. Okay, what are the determinants of demand and what are the determinants of supply? And what is this story telling me about whether the demand or the supply should change? And so among the first miss all semester. Right? Among the determinants of demand are the prices of complements and the prices of substitutes. And coffee and donuts could be substitutes, but we'd rather they not be. We'd rather that they be complements. And when the price of a substitute goes up, right, then we're going to buy more of the original good. But when the price of a complement goes up, then we're going to buy less of the good. And the reason is we want to buy that bundle, right? The coffee and donut bundle is together. So when the price of coffee goes up, it's like the price of the bundle has gone up, so we're going to buy less of the bundle. Now, I've left something off here already, and that is which market it is I'm talking about. Right? You could have gotten confused and put coffee there instead, and sometimes students do. Okay, so in this case, what's going to happen is that the demand curve will decrease because the price of a complement has gone up. Okay, complements and substitutes. We didn't talk a lot about this at the beginning of the semester, but I'm going to cover some of it real quick now. What's a good substitute for coffee? Yeah.
Tea.
Sure, tea. Sometimes people will drink tea instead of coffee. Maybe you get a Red Bull, right? Or a Monster drink or something else like that, right? Or a Coke. Okay, so all those different kinds of things are good substitutes for a cup of coffee. What's a good substitute for gasoline? So in 2008, let me tell you a little story, right? Okay. In 2008, I graduated from North Carolina State University with my undergrad. All right, I was 32 years old when I finished my undergraduate. So those of you who are older, you got time. It's okay. And we were moving from North Carolina to Virginia so I could go to grad school at George Mason. And right at about that same time, Katrina, the hurricane, hit Louisiana, took out a bunch of major refineries. So the price of gasoline went up to $5 a gallon. Right? Now I had to rent a U-Haul and move all my stuff, mostly books, to Virginia. And I had to get a big U-Haul and pay that $5 a gallon. What were my options? What else could I have done? Yeah.
Rented a diesel truck?
I could have rented a diesel truck. I probably didn't even think about that. Okay, but I had to bring my stuff, right? In the short run, my demand for elasticity, even though the price had gone up, was really inelastic. I was going to pay it. So I rented the truck, and it cost me like $500 to move my stuff. Not even all that far. I got all my stuff to Virginia. Well, in the short run, if the price of gasoline, now it's been hovering around $2 recently, right? What if the price of gasoline jumped up to $5 a gallon? What would you do tomorrow? Suppose you live off campus and you gotta get to class. You don't have to come to class, right? But suppose you had to. You'd end up having to pay for the gas. Okay. Or if you had to get to work, in the short run, your demand is really inelastic. But the longer that the price change stays in effect, you might make some changes. Like what?
You invest like in an electric car or...
You could switch to an electric car, or you could sell the Escalade and buy a Prius, right? All y'all are driving Escalades, aren't you? No. What else could you do? Other options. What do you got? What other options?
Electric car.
Electric car. Yeah.
You do like a bike or a longboard.
Sure, you could ride a bike, right? You could get one of those one-wheeled hoverboard things I've seen going around campus and get to campus on that, or an electric skateboard or something like that. All right. You could carpool. You might move your apartment. You might move to an apartment that's really close to campus, right? You can do any of these different kinds of things to try to save money. The longer that a price change stays in effect, the more substitutes we will find for that good or service that has had that high price change. That's actually the second law of demand. The first law of demand is that demand slopes down, right? The second law of demand is the longer that a price change stays in effect, the more substitutes people will find, so the more elastic rather than inelastic, the more elastic demand will become for that product. So, suppose the price of gas stays really high. My grandmother went and bought a new freezer. Well, how is that a substitute for gasoline? You got to make fewer trips to the grocery store, right? You find ways to accommodate for that high price change in the long run. So changes in prices of substitute goods, right, will generate these kinds of effects. Okay, enough about supply and demand for today. Let me do a couple of notes about just logistics for the course. I haven't posted content quizzes for the stuff on Canvas in a while, but you have an exam coming up. So how can you know like what stuff is important on Canvas if you haven't had the quizzes to get that feedback? I'm going to create a bunch of quizzes that you guys can do. They're not high stakes, they're all really low stakes in terms of like the points, but I still want to give you that opportunity to get a little bit of feedback. And what I try to do when I grade them is to offer some comments. Now, if you've got any questions about the grades that you've gotten on these quizzes so far, let me know and I'll go back over it because my GA has graded some of them. And so I can check the answers and make sure and maybe give you some comments about why you got a question wrong. I'm happy to do that. On the exam, it's going to be October 23rd through 26th. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that, but it's going to be in that time frame. Now, I know that Chegg is out there. I know that Slater is out there. I know that Quizlet is out there. I know that you can get the test bank to almost any exam that anybody could ever come up with. So how can I prevent cheating so that those of you who are honest aren't penalized by those who might cheat? Now, none of you in this room are going to cheat, right? But the only way that I can see that I can do this fairly is to make the amount of time that you have to take the exam shorter. So it'll be 50 multiple choice questions. You'll have to complete it in an hour. So you have a limited amount of time to complete the exam. So that means that you're going to have to study ahead of time so that you, instead of like knowing the answer to that question or looking up the answer to that question, instead, that way you understand the theory and have an intuitive response about what the correct answer is. Next, there's going to be a new GDP assignment coming up. We're going to talk about GDP today. I'm creating a new assignment, and you're going to get a picture of a map of the United States. And in place of every state name, there's a country name. And that country has the same GDP as the United States. I'm sorry, not as the entire United States, but as that particular state. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide you with data for each state, I'm going to assign you each a state and the country, and then you're going to have to process that data. You're going to have to do some calculations in Excel to create new data columns, and then you're going to have to create graphs in Excel. And then you'll cut and paste those graphs from Excel into a Word document that produces a report where you're going to write up what you notice about the differences between that country and that state, or the similarities between that country and that state. So what you get out of this is a product that you can potentially show to an employer that says, look, I know how to use Excel. I know how to create graphs in Excel. I know how to use calculations in Excel and process data in Excel. I know how to create a written report that looks nice and professional. And potentially you could even hand this report to an employer at some point and say, hey, look, this is what I did. I know how to do this. It becomes something that is part of your portfolio of work going forward. It's what they call an authentic assignment. Next, I just want to take a minute to talk about the Nobel Prize. Nobel Prize was awarded on Monday in economics. And this year it was awarded to two guys, Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson. It turns out that Robert Wilson was Paul Milgram's dissertation advisor. Okay. Now, they won the Nobel Prize for their work on auctions, on auction theory. Suppose you want to buy a Monet, a famous painting. Is there a thick market with lots of buyers and sellers out there trying to sell a Monet or buy a Monet? Can you go on a website and buy a Monet? No. How do they sell something that's rare like that? They sell it at an auction. Well, what kind of an auction? There's lots of different kinds of auctions, right? It's not going to be some guy up in front going, hey, I got a Monet, anybody want to buy a Monet, I'm going to paint, sunflowers, no, that's how they sell cows, not how they sell paintings, right? But they're going to have a room where they're going to have the painting for sale, and they might have people hold up cards to say, I'll bid the next higher price, or I'll bid the next higher price. That's one way of doing an auction. Another way of doing an auction is to have everybody get an envelope, and they write down how much they would be willing to pay for the painting, stick it in an envelope, then the auctioneer opens all the envelopes and finds out who's willing to pay the most, and they win the auction. Right? Which approach is more likely to get a higher price for the painting? Yeah?
The thing.
Why?
Because like when you're doing it, the feeling of it is gonna overtake when you're bidding.
Okay, so you think people become irrational when they're using millions of dollars? Maybe, yeah?
The competition.
There's a competition element to it, so you become competitive with the person, another bidder. That could be the case. I'm not sure, but because if it's all like write it down, then you don't know what other people are going to bid. So that might mean that you're going to bid even higher because you want to make sure that you win it. Either way, if you win the auction, what's the painting worth? Suppose you bid $1.7 million for the painting, and that's the highest bid. What's the painting worth? To you, it might be worth 1.7, but obviously it's not worth that much to anybody else. So as soon as you buy it and pay that 1.7, if you want to turn around and sell it, you can't, or at least not for that same amount. The best you can sell it for is whatever the second highest bid would have been, which is to say that as soon as you win the auction, you kind of lost. You kind of lost because you paid more for it than you had to. One way that they overcome this problem is that the bidder who bids the highest has to pay the same amount that the second highest bidder would have paid, plus a few dollars more. Right? That way you're not paying a whole lot extra for it. Does that make sense? What other kinds of things might we sell in an auction? Jewelry, sure. How about bandwidth or frequencies? Right? When cell phones were developing through the 90s and 2000s, right, we needed to use more and more frequency or bandwidth through the airwaves to connect all of these phones. Well, if you want to use some bandwidth that isn't currently being used, who do you buy it from? Nobody else is using it. Usually if you want to buy something from somebody, you have to buy it from somebody who's using it in some way. It has to have value. But the bandwidth was just sitting there. Nobody was using it. So you could start using some bandwidth, but then somebody else could also start using the same bandwidth, right? And then I hear all about your conversation because I'm listening to the same bandwidth. Right? Do we want that to happen? Do we want to hear each other's conversations like back in the old days of telephones with party lines? That's how it actually used to work. There was one telephone line that went to the whole neighborhood, and you could pick up the phone and somebody was telling somebody about something that you don't really want to hear about. What Milgram did was he figured out how to have the government auction off that new bandwidth when they made it available, so that there was not overlaps, so that everybody had their own bandwidth. And he figured out how to do that most efficiently. And so he won the Nobel Prize for that. Now, Robert Wilson talked about that winner's curse thing, about how when you win the auction, you immediately have already lost it, in a way. And what's interesting is they both teach at Stanford. They're both old guys at this point, right? And they both teach at Stanford University. And the Nobel Prize committee called up Milgram to tell him, you won the Nobel Prize, but he was asleep. He wasn't picking up his phone. So Wilson and his wife, right, come over to Milgram's house in the nighttime and ring on the doorbell and knock on the door trying to say, hey, the Nobel Prize committee is trying to call you to tell you you won the Nobel Prize, but you're not answering your phone. Pick up your cell phone, right? How do we know they did this? Because Milgram has one of those Nest cameras on his front door when you ring the doorbell, and they got the whole thing on tape and it's online now. And you can see the whole thing happen. It's hilarious. Okay. So Nobel Prize on Monday. It's a boring Nobel Prize, but it's also interesting. Today we're going to step into and start thinking about macroeconomics in general. All right, macroeconomics. We know that the economy that we live in has been growing at a certain rate over time. We can kind of take that for granted. There's nothing to say that the economy has to keep growing. We know that during some time periods the economy is growing fast, and at other time periods the economy is growing slow and may even be declining. That's kind of what we're in right now, is a recession brought about by COVID. What often happens is the government tries to find ways to bring the economy back into a growth period out of a recession. Why? Why does the government care whether the economy is growing or contracting? Yeah.
Failing economy doesn't pay very good taxes.
Bingo. The answer is not the government loves you and cares about you and wants to take care of you. Maybe, that's being nice, but that's probably not a robust assumption about why the government cares. The government cares because they're interested in their tax revenues. Are you with me? And so the government wants to know how much is it bringing in taxes. And so what the government does is it collects as much data as it can about how much people are spending on different things so that it can accurately determine how much is being paid in taxes. And we go back to that idea from the Laffer curve a couple of days ago where we're talking about how the government doesn't want to charge too high of a tax rate because then it would actually have less in revenues. Do you follow? So then, the government collects statistics and calculates a measure called GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. They only started collecting GDP data in the 1900s. Before then there wasn't the same amount of robust statistical collection going on. Okay. Now, what is GDP? It's a good definition for GDP. We can say that GDP is the legal, not interjecting that, market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. Which goods and services? All of them. All of them. Now, when we think about the market economy and the production of GDP, is GDP something you can eat? Hey, I'll have another bite of GDP. Is it something you can wear? I need to go buy a new GDP. This one's getting old and ratty. No, GDP is an aggregate measure of all of the different things. The way we calculate GDP is we take the price of each thing, let's say apples, multiply it by the quantity of apples sold in a certain year. And then we add to that the price of the oranges sold in that year times the quantity of oranges sold in that year, plus, well, the price of any other thing, all the other things, really, times the quantity of all those other things. We add it all up. We get out something called nominal GDP, which is the dollar amount of all of those different goods and services added up together, our nominal GDP. Okay, what kinds of things are included in GDP? Well, the legal market value of all final goods and services, or the market value of all legal final goods and services. Why do I say legal? Yeah.
Black market.
Okay, so stuff that's bought and sold on the black market, does the government have receipts for that? No, they don't have receipts for it, and so they also can't tax it, can they? So suppose we're talking about marijuana for a minute, right? Now in some states, marijuana is legal. Why do they make marijuana legal in those states? Because people want it, right? No, you're right. I heard the right answer. It's because the government wants to tax it, right? The government wants to tax it. It's not because the government respects your choices about the things that you prefer to consume, right? It's not because the government realizes, hey, there's an opportunity for the supply and demand of marijuana to exist such that consumers capture surpluses and producers capture surpluses. That's not their interest. The interest is that, hey, if we allow a legal market in this, we can impose a tax and we can capture some tax revenues. What does the government not care about? The fact that it's going to also create dead weight losses. Right? The economist says, hey, people want to smoke pot, let them. Or at least, objectively speaking, if that's what makes them happy, then who am I to say that they should or shouldn't do it? That's a purely positive analysis. But the economist does say, hey, if you do legalize it, don't tax it, don't regulate it, because as soon as you do that, you're creating dead weight losses. Oftentimes, the government will justify the legalization of taxes, saying, hey, marijuana, saying, hey, we're going to legalize marijuana, and then we'll tax it, so it'll increase tax revenues. And that's the reason why they say we should allow marijuana to become legal. That's the wrong reason for saying marijuana should be legal. And it's just an excuse to collect another tax. It's a problem. Okay. So, the GDP doesn't include all of the illegal goods that are bought and sold. GDP includes the market value. So the price that actually gets paid for goods in the marketplace is the price that gets recorded or included when we calculate GDP. Now we only calculate the price, the market value of final goods and services. So you go and you buy some milk, some flour, some sugar, some eggs, you take it home, you bake a cake, you eat the cake. I'm like Tina Fey with a sheet cake there, right? Which numbers get reported for GDP? Well, the purchase of the ingredients gets reported because I didn't sell the cake, I ate it. Now, if I had taken that same cake and sold it on the market, then only the price of the cake once I sold it would be included in GDP. The price of the ingredients would not be included because we don't want to double count things. We don't want to count the same thing twice. What GDP is really trying to get at, if we're thinking nicely about it, is trying to determine the quality of life that people are enjoying in the market. GDP is really about trying to understand our quality of life. And our quality of life isn't based upon the prices of things. Our quality of life is based upon how much actual stuff we can have. the stuff. Nominal GDP calculates how much stuff we have at the prices given for each of those different things. It's like the name of the things that we have, or the dollar name of the stuff that we have. But we're not really, in the long run, interested in the dollar value of all the things that we're able to buy. What we're interested in is the stuff, the actual things that we can get. We're interested in the real GDP, not so much in the nominal. So we're going to have to figure out a way to calculate real GDP from the nominal GDP. GDP calculates the legal market value of all final goods and services. Of all final goods and services. So I bought a used car a couple months ago. I got a 2014 Honda Accord. I picked it up with only 21,000 miles on it. It was a killer deal. Right? Does that get counted towards GDP for 2020? No, because the car was made in 2014 and it was already counted towards GDP in 2014. That tells us how much stuff we made in 2014. That car wasn't made in 2020, it was made in 2014. We don't want to double count. We want to count it in the right year so it gets counted in 2014. However, when I bought that car from the dealership had already bought the car from somebody else. Are they going to sell the car to me for the same price that they bought it from the other people? No. They're going to bump up the price. Why? Well, they got to pay for the repairs, the cleaning, right, and the salesman's commission. All of those are services that were generated this year. So all those services are counted towards GDP for this year, not for 2014. Does that make sense? We're trying to account for goods and services produced in a given year. The car was made in 2014. The services were provided in 2020. That's how we distinguish amongst these things. Okay, we want to talk about all the legal market value of all final goods and services produced within a country. Produced within a country. So then if there are some foreigners living in the United States that are working in the United States being productive, does their produce count towards GDP? Yeah, because they live here. What about if some United States firm owns a factory in another country and they produce goods and services there that get sold there? That doesn't get counted towards GDP. Now, a lot of the measure of GDP is calculated using the receipts of stuff that gets sold. And some stuff that gets sold is produced in another country, and some stuff that gets sold, some stuff that gets produced gets sold in a different country. In other words, there are imports and exports. How do we account for the fact that there are imports and exports? We want to know what was produced in the country. So at the border, when stuff comes in and out of the country, they count how much stuff is being exported, and they count how much stuff is being imported, and then they net it out in order to get a good idea of how much stuff was produced in the country at the end of the year. They want to understand the difference between imports and exports because they're trying to understand how productive we have been. Now, GDP is calculated actually every quarter. They do a full statistical analysis every 3 months. But usually when we talk about GDP, we just are generally talking about annual levels of GDP, not quarterly levels of GDP. Any questions? No, okay. GDP is about how much stuff is being produced within a given time frame. Okay, so that means that GDP is a flow concept. It's a flow concept versus a stock concept. The idea being that what we're measuring is how much new stuff is being produced in a given year. Now, I have a car from 2014. Was that produced this year? No. Do I still have it? Yeah. The stuff that I have is the stock of all goods and services that I currently own. It's kind of like my wealth. How much stuff do you actually have? And this is kind of like my income. If you think about it like a bathtub, right? There's a faucet, and into that faucet is being poured all of the new GDP. All the new GDP is coming in through the faucet into the economy. However, some of the stuff that we have is wearing out over time. It's depreciating. It's not worth as much as it used to be, right? The shoes that you're wearing are eventually going to wear out, right? Hopefully someday I'll lose enough weight that this shirt will be too big for me and I'll have to get rid of it, right? So things are wearing out over time. They're depreciating. So my stock is draining out of the bathtub at the same time as the flow of new stuff is coming in. Hopefully the flow of new stuff is flowing in faster than the stuff that's draining out, so that my overall wealth is increasing over time. Are you with me? GDP is a flow concept, not a stock. I don't mean like stock market stocks here. I'm talking about real stuff. The stock of real stuff that we have, like a stock room where we keep stuff. Now, GDP is an accounting identity. The way that we figure out GDP is really to help the accountants. All right, so that we get a fair measure with a bunch of rules that everybody agrees, these are the rules we're going to use when we calculate GDP. That way we have a consistent measure that each of us can use. So it's an accounting identity. So in a way it's kind of boring to an economist because we don't like accounting all that much. We're not interested all that much in it. But because it's not really about human behavior. It's really just about a ledger. But we can learn something from having that accounting done accurately. What can we learn? Well, here we added up the nominal GDP for the year 2012. What I'd like to know is if in 2013 the quality of life for people was any better or any worse than it was in 2012. So I could go out there and I could find the data that says the price of apples in 2013 and the quantity of apples sold in 2013, and I could find the data that tells me the price of oranges in 2013 and the quantity of oranges that were sold in 2013. And I could do that for every good and service in the market. And I could add it all up, and I would get a new nominal GDP measure for 2013. Here's the GDP for 2012. By looking at the nominal GDP for 2012 and the nominal GDP for 2013, can I know anything about the changes in quality of life of the individuals living in the country? Not immediately. Why not? Yeah.
Because the price changed, or
The prices of things could change. As a matter of fact, the prices of everything could change. Or at least in general, the prices of things could change, right? It could be that inflation has caused the prices of all of these different goods and services to go up by some. What I want to really compare is the amount of stuff. I want to compare just the quantities of things over time to be able to really measure the change in GDP. How could I do that? What I could do to try to just measure the real GDP growth between the 2 years is I could calculate the GDP from 2013, but use the prices from 2012, so that way I'm comparing the same amount of stuff between the 2 years. So in that case, I would take the price of apples in 2012 times the quantity of apples in 2013. So I'm using the prices from 2012, but the quantities from 2013. And when I add all of these different things up, price of oranges in 2012 times the quantity of oranges in 2013, plus the price of other things in 2012 times the quantity of all the other things in 2013. What I'll get out of this is something called real GDP of the year 2013, expressed in terms of prices from 2012. Now, since we're going to use 2012 as a base year, this nominal GDP of 2012 is also the real GDP in terms of 2012 prices. And then I can see how much the economy maybe grew. So if the GDP in 2012, in 2012 prices, was $15 trillion, and the GDP in 2013, in 2012 prices, was $16 trillion, then how much did the economy grow? Well, the way you would calculate this is you would take the GDP from the new year, which is 16 trillion, minus the GDP from the first year, and then divide it by the GDP from the first year, and you would get 1/15. What's 1/15? What percentage is 1/15? Sorry?
I got 6.6%.
That's about right, 6.6%. Okay. So that would be real GDP growth rate. The rate at which the GDP is growing in real terms. It could be that, this number I said was 15 trillion, and I said this number was 16 trillion. This number could have been, what, 18 trillion. Nominal GDP growth rate would be larger than real GDP growth rate because what's involved? Inflation. By using the 2012 prices instead of the 2013 prices, I correct for inflation. And that's what I want to do when I'm really trying to figure out how much better off we are this year as compared to last year. I want to look at real GDP growth. Is 6.6% a high or a low GDP growth rate? High, low, okay. The United States has been growing for the last 100 years or so at a GDP growth rate between 2 and 3%. At a growth rate of 2%, the quality of life for individuals in that country doubles every 35 years. So, can you imagine your grandparents' generation? They had about half as much of everything as what you have. Can you imagine having half as many things as you currently have? Let's do it the other way around. Can you imagine having twice as much of everything as what you currently have? Twice as many shoes, twice as many shirts, twice as big of an apartment, twice as much of everything. Can you imagine that? It'll be hard to imagine. Other countries have had different growth rates over time. China, over the last decade, had a growth rate around 10%. 10%, that means that the quality of life for people living in China has doubled over the course of 7 years. In 7 years' time, twice as much of everything. I have a friend from Suzhou, right, who told me about the first time that she's about the same age as me. She lived here in the States, was an executive in an auto manufacturing plant in Richmond. And she was telling me about the first time that she remembers her family getting, not a TV. She remembers the first time her family got, not a radio. She remembers the first time her family got a light bulb. The first time her family had electricity in their apartment. In her lifetime, she's about the same age as me. Today, I went and visited her in Suzhou, right? Am I saying it right? Am I saying Suzhou? Yeah, okay. Today she's driving a really nice white Audi SUV all around China, right? Can you imagine in your lifetime going from not having a light bulb to then driving an Audi SUV? That's the rate of growth that has been experienced by many people. Not everybody, but by many people in China. It's incredible. The 6% growth rate would be very good. It would be incredible, actually. How can we think about this for ourselves? Somebody found an old Sears catalog. Sears was a store where you used to go to buy stuff in the mall. Right? It's shut down now. They went out of business. Nobody would have believed you if you told them that Sears was going to go out of business. Somebody found an old Sears catalog from 1975. The best black and white television that Sears was selling in 1975 cost $137.95. Now, this article that I'm looking at was written in 2006. And in 2006, if you correct for inflation, $137 turns out to be worth about $488. That was 14 years ago. So today, right, that would probably be around $600, maybe $700. Now, this is for a black and white TV. By the way, TVs weren't very big then. Okay? It's probably talking like a 17, maybe a 19-inch screen on a black and white TV. And guess what? There were 3 channels. If you could get those 3 channels. Maybe 4 if you got PBS. Watch Mr. Rogers. Right? Today, on Amazon Prime, they're selling, on Prime Day, they're selling a 55-inch 4K color flat screen TV for $300. That doesn't show up in the quantity part of the calculation of GDP. They try to correct for it. They use something called a chained CPI, Consumer Price Index, to try to correct for the fact that the quality of things has changed, but they're not really very good at it. They can't do it perfectly. For example, when I was a kid and I went to school, and my mom gave me an apple to put in my lunchbox, what kind of an apple did she put in my lunchbox? Most of the time, it would have been a Red Delicious apple. And Red Delicious apples are horrible. I don't like them at all. I remember the first time I went to the grocery store in about 2006, 2007, and got the best apple I had ever had in my life. What kind of apple was it?
Fiji.
Huh?
A Fiji apple?
No, better than a Fiji.
Gala?
Honeycrisp. You don't like the Honeycrisp, you prefer the Gala?
Gala apples are the best. If you have
Okay.
them.
All right, there's some controversy. I actually have a Gala apple on my desk in my office right now. Okay, so they were like $4 a pound for those apples. But they were worth it. So good. Honeycrisp apples, so delicious, right? How do you show the change in quality of apples between 2006 and 2010? Really hard to show. Especially because once people started buying those Honeycrisp apples, the guys who owned the orchards would cut the limbs off of the trees and cut the Red Delicious limbs off and graft in Honeycrisp limbs so that they could grow more Honeycrisp apples. And as they're starting to grow more Honeycrisp and Gala apples, what happens to the price of Honeycrisp and Gala apples? It comes down. What is that? How do we understand that? I was paying $4 for that apple, but now I can pay $2 for that apple. What do we call the difference? Consumer surplus. And consumer surplus has increased dramatically, but it doesn't get captured in the calculation of GDP. We don't see how GDP doesn't actually capture all of the changes in a person's quality of life. It only captures some of the changes in a person's quality of life. Just the money parts. But remember, money isn't everything, right? We're capturing so much more than just having more money. Even in real terms, we're having not just more stuff in real terms, we're having higher quality stuff in real terms. And that's how most of our benefit is being captured these days, is in higher quality things. There are ways to calculate the changes in GDP, and one of them is this, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is like a grocery cart of all of the stuff, or of a bunch of products that somebody would buy, and that the same households would buy every year. And so what the government did was they collected a grocery cart, and they said, okay, in 1985, how much would somebody put in the cart for $100? And they found all the stuff that you would buy for $100, and then they said, okay, well then in 1986, how much would it cost to buy the same shopping cart? Right, maybe it was $102. And how much would it cost to buy the same shopping cart in 2020? Maybe it's $280 for the same stuff. So that if you want to compare prices between some year in the past and prices in today's terms, if you wanna know how much, so gasoline costs $2 a gallon today, right? What would the equivalent of $2 a gallon have been back in 1985? You would take that $2 and you would divide it by the CPI for this year and multiply it by the CPI for the previous year, and you would get some different number. And I think this is like 38 cents or something close to that. So gasoline would have been 38 cents a gallon back then, and that would have been the same as paying $2 a gallon today. This is how we would be able to compare. Have the prices of gasoline gone up or down over time?
Down.
They actually, in many cases, have gone down.
Did it used to be like 80 cents? Not.
Well, it depends on real terms. You have to correct for inflation, right? You have to correct for inflation. And you have to take measure of it. It's fluctuated though, right? Now, if we were really running out of gasoline, what would happen to the price of gasoline? It'd be going up. But what's happening? We're finding more gasoline. And the cars that we have are using less of it than they used in the past. Okay, so the CPI is a measure. Now it's called the Consumer Price Index. Why? Because it only captures the changes in prices of consumer goods. But it's not only consumers who are buying things. Who else buys things? Consumers buy things. Who else buys things? The government buys things. Who else buys things? Businesses, investors. And also foreigners buy things that we make, and then we also buy things that foreigners make. This is the basic formula for calculating GDP. GDP is equal to the consumption of consumers, the expenditures of consumers, of investors, of the government, exports and imports. And we usually combine these two together and call it net exports. So we have just one symbol for all that. And then we replace GDP with Y. We just use Y as the symbol to talk about GDP, just so that we have a shorthand term for it. Similarly, we're just going to use pi to talk about inflation over time. And we're going to build a model where instead of price and quantity on the axes, we're going to talk about not just the quantity of a certain thing, but we're going to talk about the quantity of all the things. And we're going to not talk about the price of a certain thing, but we're going to talk about the price rate, the rate of change of prices, or the inflation rate over time. And we'll build something that's similar to a supply and demand graph, but it's going to have an extra line on it, called long run aggregate supply. This is what we're aiming for. This is what the second half of the semester is about. Is building a model to think about what's happening in the economy and how the government tries to intervene and other institutions try to intervene in the market to bring about an equilibrium. Any questions for me? Okay, yes?
Wouldn't it be better if they just didn't touch it?
Maybe. Better for who? It's a normative question.
Consumers.
Not necessarily. Which consumers? Right? Which consumers? It is a healthy approach to ask who is benefiting from a change in policy and who is being harmed from a change in policy, and whether we can all agree to sacrifice a little bit for the sake of some others. But that's a conversation that we have to have in public. Okay, have a good day.